Sleeping in 1850 was worse than a nightmare. In November 1857, a coroner in Limehouse, East London, opened an inquest into the deaths of a mother and her 2 children, found lifeless in their beds, without a mark of violence on them. The window had been sealed shut against the cold. The fire had burned low in the grate overnight, its last embers just visible under a skin of gray ash. And by morning, all 3 were gone. No wound, no struggle, no sound anyone in the house next door had heard. The question wasn't simply what killed them. The question was why nobody in that room ever realized they were in danger at all. Before this story ends, you'll understand why the very room those Victorians thought was protecting them was often the thing quietly working against them. You'll see why the walls of the finest homes in London could be more dangerous than the slums beneath them. And you'll learn why the ancient rhythm of human sleep itself was being rewritten in real time by a century that believed at every step it was making life safer. This isn't a story about squalor. It's a story about people doing everything they were told was right, and how catastrophically wrong that could still go. Start with the room itself, because the room is where all of this begins. The window is shut, sometimes nailed shut, because doctors and laypeople alike believed the night air outside carried disease into the lungs of the sleeping. The mattress is a lumpy sack of straw or flock, and bedbugs are so common that some households burn sulfur candles just to clear the room before anyone dares climb in, the smoke stinging their eyes in a space with nowhere for it to go. Multiple bodies share that one bed, parents, children, sometimes a lodger taken in for extra rent, all breathing the same stagnant air until dawn. In the poorest parts of Manchester and London's East End, families didn't even get a bed to themselves for the night. They rented it in shifts, one set of sleepers rising for early work while another climbed in, still warm, from the last occupant. It sounds almost impossible that a species could function this way, night after night, for an entire lifetime. And yet in 1850, this was simply Tuesday. So why seal the room at all, against the one thing outside that might actually have helped? Because the greatest fear of the age was the air itself. And here is the first quiet horror of the story. The danger was never coming from outside that window. It was already inside, and closing the window only sealed it in. Coal fires heated most homes, and in a tightly shut, poorly ventilated bedroom, incomplete combustion produced carbon monoxide, a gas with no smell, no color, no taste, and no warning of any kind. A gas that binds to hemoglobin far more strongly than oxygen, interfering with the blood's ability to deliver oxygen throughout the body. Physicians investigating unexplained bedroom deaths across the 1850s increasingly suspected fume poisoning from coal grates, though the precise mechanism wouldn't be understood for decades more. Picture it: a mother banking the fire before bed, tucking her children in, checking the window one last time, performing every ritual of care she knew. And in doing so, sealing the room around an invisible killer already rising from her own hearth. A family could do everything right by the standards of their time and simply not wake up. But even if that family had opened the window, another danger could still have been waiting for them, not in the air this time, but on the walls. It would be easy to assume the worst bedrooms belonged to the poor, that danger, like dirt, stayed on one side of the city. The deeper you look, the more that assumption collapses. A brilliant, wildly fashionable pigment called Scheele's green, made using arsenic, colored enormous quantities of Victorian wallpaper. In damp English homes, that pigment could degrade, and physicians of the time increasingly linked ailing households to the arsenic in their own walls, though exactly how much of it reached the air people breathed versus dust and handling is still debated by researchers today. What isn't in doubt is that families sickened in rooms papered in it, children with unexplained rashes, servants with chronic headaches, entire households weakening in spaces that looked, by every visible measure, beautiful. This wasn't a mark of poverty. It was a mark of taste. Wealthy families papered their finest, most admired rooms in that shade of green because no other pigment produced a color that vivid, that alive. Despite growing warnings, widespread use of arsenical pigments continued for decades. The nightmare wasn't confined to the slums. It was stitched into elegance itself, hanging on the walls of drawing rooms where guests admired the wallpaper before dinner. And still, even the bed itself offered no real refuge. Overcrowding in the poorest districts grew so severe that landlords devised something almost unthinkable by modern standards: the twopenny hangover, a bench where the destitute paid a couple of pennies to sleep sitting upright, arms draped over a length of rope strung taut across the room. In the morning, the rope was simply released, and everyone slumped forward at once, jolted awake together like a row of puppets losing their strings in the same instant. It reads almost like dark comedy now. It wasn't. It was economics colliding head-on with survival in a housing crisis that left tens of thousands with nowhere else to lay their heads at all. Now pull back and look at these three dangers together: the air, the walls, the bed, and a pattern emerges that's stranger and darker than any single fact inside it. None of this happened because people were careless. Mothers stuffed rags into window frames specifically to protect their children, believing they were sealing out a poisoned miasma thought to rise from swamps, sewage, and the night air itself. They weren't ignoring the danger. They were defending against it with total sincerity, just against the wrong enemy, while the real threat accumulated quietly in the very room they believed they'd made safe. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick, whose 1842 sanitary report shocked Parliament with its detail, spent careers trying to convince a skeptical public that these weren't private misfortunes but a public catastrophe, one fueling outbreaks of typhus and cholera that didn't respect the line between slum and townhouse. Even Napoleon gets pulled into this story. Arsenic was later found in his old wallpaper on St. Helena, and a tidy legend grew up around it. But arsenic was so common in the era's dyes, medicines, and cosmetics that its presence alone proves exposure, not murder, and historians remain divided on what actually killed him. The myth persists because it's neat. The reality is stranger, not one hidden assassin behind one famous wall, but an entire century unknowingly poisoning itself in plain sight. And yet neither the air nor the walls explain the strangest thing the Victorians were quietly losing. Something older than either danger and harder to see: their sleep itself. For centuries, there is substantial evidence that many pre-industrial Europeans did not sleep in one unbroken block through the night. The historian A. Roger Eckerch, examining diaries, court records, and medical texts, found that a segmented pattern, a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness used for prayer, conversation, or simply lying in the dark with one's own thoughts, appears again and again across pre-industrial life. It wasn't necessarily considered insomnia. It was ordinary enough that people had language built around it, and by 1850, that older rhythm was quietly fading. Gas street lighting stretched the working day artificially later into darkness. Factory bells demanded one continuous, efficient block of rest before the next shift began. The bedroom that could poison you through its air and its walls was also, in the same decades, having one of its oldest and most natural patterns dismantled by the very century that built those walls around it, which brings the story back to that sealed room in Limehouse. Whatever exactly killed that mother and her two children, one detail makes it harder to shake than almost any other. They didn't die somewhere that looked dangerous. The window was closed the way a caring parent closes a window. The fire was banked low the way a careful parent banks a fire. The bed was the same bed the family slept in every single night of their lives. Nothing about that room looked like a weapon. The Victorians weren't reckless, and they weren't fools. They sealed their windows out of love. They papered their walls out of pride. They packed their beds out of necessity. And at nearly every turn, the precaution and the peril turned out to be the very same object, seen from two different angles at once. The nightmare was never that the Victorian bedroom looked dangerous. The nightmare was that it looked like home. And that danger didn't disappear with gas lamps and coal grates and arsenic dye. It just changed its disguise. Every generation still seals its windows against the threat it thinks it understands, while something quieter gathers unnoticed in the one room it forgot to check.